The headache started before she opened the envelope. Tess always said Margot had a gift for sensing bad news, the way a dog knows rain before the clouds even gather. Margot had never believed that. She believed in numbers. Numbers didn't lie, didn't flinch, didn't show up 40 minutes late to their own engagement dinner wearing someone else's perfume. Except that's exactly what Brendan did. She'd been sitting at table 7 at Auberge du Pommier, the one by the window overlooking the courtyard. The one she'd specifically requested because the light was good, and she'd wanted everything to be good that night. She'd pressed her dress twice. She'd practiced her smile in the car mirror until it looked effortless. She'd even gotten her nails done, which she hated, because Brendan's mother always noticed, and always mentioned it if she hadn't. At 7:43, she saw him through the window before he saw her. He was coming around the corner of the building, not from the parking garage where everyone parked, and he was fixing his collar, and the woman with him was tucking her hair behind her ear in that particular way that women do when they've just finished doing something they'd rather not explain. Margot recognized the woman immediately. You don't forget your younger sister's laugh. It carries. She didn't cry. That part came later, or maybe it didn't come at all. She was honestly still waiting. What she did was pick up her water glass, drink the whole thing, set it down exactly in the center of her placemat, and then open her purse and leave $430 on the table for a dinner she hadn't touched. The math was automatic. It always was. She'd been calculating bills and splitting costs and running figures since she was 11 years old, sitting at her mother's kitchen table, trying to explain to a woman who could barely read why the hydro bill was 30% higher in January. She left without saying a word to either of them. She drove for 20 minutes before she realized she was headed nowhere in particular, and another 10 before she admitted she was crying, and another 5 before she pulled into the parking lot of a bar she'd never been to called The Ledger, which, given everything, felt like the universe was making a very low-effort joke at her expense. It was a Thursday. The place was half full. Nobody looked up when she came in, which was exactly what she needed, and she sat down at the far end of the bar, where the light was dim and the stool was slightly uneven, and she didn't have to look at anyone's face. Whatever's strongest, she told the bartender. He was young, maybe 25, with the careful eyes of someone who'd seen a lot of Thursday nights. He didn't ask questions. He brought her something amber in a short glass, and she drank half of it immediately, and then sat there looking at the other half like it owed her an explanation. She'd been engaged for 14 months. She'd spent 11 of those months planning a wedding she couldn't afford on a budget that made her physically ill every time she opened the spreadsheet, which she did every Sunday morning because she was constitutionally incapable of not knowing where every dollar was going. The venue deposit was non-refundable. The photographer had a cancellation policy that amounted to legal extortion. The florist, the florist, had required a 30% upfront payment that Margot had paid out of the savings account she'd been building since her first job at 16 shelving books at the Scarborough Public Library. $12,000. Gone. Not gone. Technically still transacted, still recorded, still traceable in her records, but gone in the way that mattered, which was she would never get it back, and she had nothing to show for it, and somewhere across the city her fiancé was probably explaining to her sister that it was complicated. She finished the second half of her drink. Someone sat down on the stool next to her. She didn't look over. The bar was half empty. There were at least 7 other stools available. She was aware in the abstract, mildly irritated way of someone who is already at maximum irritation that whoever this was had chosen the one seat immediately adjacent to her. "You've been staring at that glass for 4 minutes," said a voice. Low. Unhurried. The kind of voice that didn't rise at the end of sentences. "I'm resting," Margot said. "You're calculating." She looked over then, because that was specific enough to be surprising. He was older than she'd expected from the voice. Or maybe the voice had just been ageless. Somewhere in his mid-40s, she'd have guessed, with the kind of face that had been handsome once, and was now something more interesting than handsome, A scar ran from his left jaw down to where his collar started. His suit cost more than her monthly rent. His hands were folded on the bar in a way that was either very relaxed or very controlled. She couldn't tell which bothered her. "Excuse me," she said. "Your eyes move when you're doing math." Left to right, then a pause, then left again. He picked up his own glass, something clear with ice. "You've been doing it since you sat down. I've been watching." That's a little unsettling. Probably. He didn't sound particularly concerned about it. Margot turned back to her empty glass. The bartender materialized, and she signaled for another, and the man beside her said nothing else, and for approximately 45 seconds she thought maybe they were done. Then he said, "Do you want to tell me what happened, or would you rather sit in it a while longer?" "I'd rather sit in it." Fair enough. She didn't know why she kept talking. Maybe it was the drink. Maybe it was the fact that he had the particular quality of someone who was not going to react to anything she said, which, right now, was exactly what she needed from another human being. "My fiancé showed up to our engagement dinner with my sister," she said. "Specifically, he showed up around the corner of the building fixing his collar, and she was tucking her hair behind her ear. I left before they saw me. I've been sitting here for," she checked her watch, "38 minutes, trying to calculate whether the non-refundable deposits on our wedding total more or less than the amount of money I loaned Brendan last year to get his car fixed." A pause. "Does it?" the man said. "It's close. The deposits are higher, but the car loan didn't have interest, and technically it should have." She looked at him sideways. "I'm Margot Vachon," he said. Not a first name. A last name dropped the way someone drops a set of keys, brief, conclusive, not looking for a response. "That French? My grandfather was from Montreal." "Are you?" "No." She waited, but nothing else came, and she decided she was too tired to push. She drank her second drink more slowly than the first. The bar noise settled around them in the easy way of Thursday night noise. Not loud, not quiet, just present. Someone was playing pool badly in the back. The jukebox had moved into something that was either country or heartbreak, which in her experience were the same genre. "The sister," Vachon said eventually. "What about her? Is she younger or older?" "Younger. 3 years." Margot set down her glass. "She borrowed my sweater last Christmas and stretched the neck out and then denied it. That's the level of person we're dealing with." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't quite a smile, more like the suggestion of one, passing through very briefly on its way to somewhere else. "And the fiancé, Brendan. He sells software solutions," which is a phrase that should have told me everything I needed to know about him. She paused. "He's not a bad person. He's just the kind of not bad person who somehow ends up doing very bad things and then is very confused about how it happened. I know people like that. Everyone does." She turned the glass in her hands. "I don't even know if I'm sad. That's the thing. I think I'm mostly angry about the spreadsheet, the wedding budget. I've been updating it every Sunday for 11 months. I color-coded it. Green for confirmed, yellow for pending, red for concerning." She paused. There was a lot of red. He looked at her with an attention that was unusual. Not the flattering kind, not the interested kind, but the kind that felt like being assessed precise. A little cold. She'd felt that kind of attention from auditors before, from bank managers in her early 20s when she'd had to beg for a business loan, from people who were deciding whether she was worth the risk. She didn't usually like it. Right now she was too wrung out to mind. "I have a proposal," Vachon said. "I don't do proposals anymore. They don't work out for me." He reached into his jacket. The movement was unhurried, matter-of-fact, and set a folder on the bar between them. Plain grey, no letterhead. "My head of accounts left 4 days ago. Took half my records with him when he went, which is both illegal and, frankly, insulting. I need someone who can reconstruct 12 months of financials from incomplete documentation, tooled cross-reference 3 sets of ledgers and identify where the discrepancies are." Margot stared at the folder. "I'm a bookkeeper," she said. "I work for a mid-size logistics company in Etobicoke." "I know." She looked at him sharply. "I was at the restaurant earlier tonight," he said. "Different table. I saw what happened. I followed you here because I thought someone who leaves $400 on a table and doesn't make a scene and drives for 30 minutes to sit alone and do math in her head is either in considerable pain or has exceptional self-control. A pause, both possibly. Margot should have been alarmed by this. The rational response to a stranger announcing he'd followed her from a restaurant was alarm. She ran a quick internal inventory of her current emotional state and found that the slot normally occupied by alarm was currently full. "That's an unusual recruitment strategy," she said. "I have an unusual operation." "What kind of operation?" He picked up his glass, finished whatever was in it, set it down with the same deliberate quietness he seemed to apply to all his movements. "The kind that requires discretion," he said, "and accuracy, and someone who isn't easily rattled. I was just rattled pretty significantly. You left $400 on the table and drove for 30 minutes before crying." His eyes didn't move from hers. "That's not rattled. That's contained." She looked at the folder. The grey of it was very neutral, very blank. It told her nothing. "What's the pay?" she said. He named a number. Margot had been handling money, other people's money, mostly for 15 years. She had a good sense of what numbers sounded like at different scales, the way a musician has a sense of pitch. The number he named landed somewhere well above market rate for contract forensic accounting, and somewhere below what you'd expect if the job involved anything straightforwardly criminal, which she suspected it did. "That's either very generous," she said, "or very dangerous. Likely both." She should have said no. She knew in the abstract that the reasonable, self-preserving, Tuesday morning version of herself would have said no without hesitation. But it was Thursday night, and she had $12,000 of non-refundable deposits on a wedding that wasn't happening, and she'd cried in a parking lot, and the man next to her spoke to her like she was someone worth speaking to accurately, which was more than she could say for the last 14 months. She opened the folder. The first page was a mess. Transposed figures, missing dates, columns that didn't add up in ways that suggested either incompetence or deliberate obfuscation. She flipped through 3 more pages. Her eyes were already moving. Left to right, pause, left again. "This is a disaster," she said. "I'm aware. Your former accounts person either had no idea what they were doing or they were stealing from you. Also both, probably. You're missing 6 weeks of reconciliations. There are 3 accounts here that don't appear anywhere in the summary ledger. And whatever this column is," she pointed to a row of figures without headers. "This shouldn't exist. Or if it does, it should definitely not be here." Vachon was watching her the same way he'd been watching her since she looked over. Steady, calculating. "Can you fix it?" he said. "I can find out what happened to it." She looked up. "That's not the same thing. It's what I need." She closed the folder, opened it again. The numbers were already reorganizing themselves in her head, the way they always did, grouping, flagging, waiting to be sorted into something that made sense. "I need access to the original source documents," she said. "Bank statements, invoices, any contracts, everything your former person touched. And I need to know what I'm actually looking at. I'm not going to reconstruct financials for something I don't understand. You'll be told what you need to know. That's not good enough." A pause, longer than his previous pauses. "The organization operates in adjacent spaces," he said. "Port logistics, private security, some real estate. The numbers you're looking at are real. The clients are real. Some of the structures are unconventional, legal grayness. Not the kind that ends up in front of a judge, the kind that requires careful accounting." She understood what he was saying. She'd done books for a restaurant once, years ago, that had needed that kind of careful accounting. She'd walked away from that job after 2 months, but she'd also been 26 and had other options and hadn't just found her fiancé sneaking around the side of a building with her sister. "I want a contract," she said. "There won't be a contract. Then I want something in writing, even a note, even a number I can call." He considered this. Then he reached into his jacket again. She was starting to catalogue his jacket as the source of all things and set a card on top of the folder. A phone number. No name, no company, no explanation. "That," Reaches me directly, he said. If you decide to walk, you walk. No consequences. Is that a thing you have to specify? Sometimes. She sat with the folder in her lap for a long moment. The pool game in the back had ended. The jukebox had gone quiet and nobody had fed it more money. The bar was smaller and quieter than it had been when she arrived. I'll need a week, she said, to assess the scope. Then I'll tell you what it'll take to fix it. He nodded once. That was apparently all the confirmation this arrangement was going to get. She picked up the card, slid it into her purse beside the receipt for a dinner she'd paid for and not eaten. Then she stood up, straightened her dress, the one she'd pressed twice, and pulled on her coat. Vachon, I do the numbers accurately. Whatever I find, I report it as it is. I don't adjust figures to be convenient. Something in his expression shifted, barely perceptible, the way a room shifts when someone opens a window you didn't know was there. That's why I followed you, he said. She left the ledger at 10:47. She didn't look back. The offices were on the 14th floor of a building in the distillery district that had, at various points in its history, been a textile warehouse, a film studio, and apparently now whatever this was. Nobody had given her a tour. Vachon's assistant, a compact woman named Gilles, who communicated almost exclusively in directions and never in explanations, had met her in the lobby on Monday morning and brought her to a room with a long table, 3 external monitors, and 7 bankers' boxes. Everything from the last 18 months, Gilles said. Mr. Vachon says you know what you're looking for. I know what I'm looking for, Margot said. I don't know what I'm going to find. Gilles seemed to consider this distinction and find it acceptable. She left. Margot took off her coat, made herself a coffee from the machine in the corner that cost more than her first car, and opened the first box. It took her 4 days to understand the scale of it. The former accounts manager, she'd gathered his name was Dunmore, she hadn't gathered much else, had been running a relatively simple long-term skim that he'd disguised with enough spreadsheet complexity to fool anyone who wasn't looking carefully. The problem was that Dunmore had been educated in obfuscation but not in accuracy, so his false columns still had to add up to something, and what they added up to, if you stared at them long enough and moved the pieces around, was a number roughly 11% higher than the reported total. 11% over 18 months. She sat back in her chair on Thursday afternoon and looked at the figure she'd written on her notepad and thought, he's going to be angry when he sees this. She was right. Vachon came in at 6, which she'd started to understand was when he came to look at what she'd found, and she walked him through it. She'd made a summary sheet. She'd color-coded it. Green for confirmed, yellow for pending, red for concerning old habits, and she'd written the total figure at the bottom in a box. He stood at the end of the table and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Is this accurate? He said finally. It's what the documents show. If you want a second opinion, I don't. He set the summary down. His face had done something very controlled that she suspected was the controlled version of something very not controlled. You found this in 4 days, the bones of it. I'd want another week to verify. Dunmore's been here for 3 years. He was good at making it look complicated. It wasn't complicated, it was just busy. She hesitated, then decided accurate was accurate. He bet on you not having someone like me. Something in the room had changed in a way she couldn't quite name. Vachon was looking at her, and it was the same assessment as the bar, the same quality of attention, but there was something else in it now that hadn't been there before. He'd be right, Vachon said, in the past. She didn't know what to do with that sentence, so she moved past it. There are a few transactions I can't account for, she said. Here and here, she pointed, is incomplete. I need to know what these were, otherwise the reconciliation will have gaps. He looked at where she was pointing, a pause. Those are payments to a protection arrangement in the East End, he said. Regular. They don't have paper documentation by design. Then we create an internal notation. Non-specific, enough to explain the outflow without detailing the source. She looked at him. That's what I'd do. Another one of those very brief, almost things at the corner of his mouth. I'll have Gilles get you what you need, he said. She nodded and started stacking her papers. She was reaching for her coat when he said, without turning around, "The wedding." She stopped. "Did you cancel it?" It wasn't a question exactly. It was more like someone placing a chess piece on a board and waiting to see if she'd respond. "I called the venue Monday morning," she said, "and the caterer, and the florist. The photographer is being difficult. Do you need help with the photographer?" She opened her mouth and then closed it. I'm going to assume that's not a literal offer. It's whatever you need it to be." She thought about the photographer's very firm cancellation policy. She thought about the email she'd sent on Tuesday that had gone unanswered. She thought about $12,000. "I'll handle it," she said. "You'll let me know if you don't." She left without answering. In the elevator going down, she realized her hands were steady. They'd been shaking, she thought, for about 2 weeks. Some part of her had stopped registering it. Brendan called on Friday. She'd known he would. He was the kind of person who needed to explain things to people. Not for the people's benefit, but for his own. The explanation as a mechanism of self-absolution. She'd watched him do it to a waiter once, a long, detailed account of why his order was wrong that hadn't been about the food at all. She let it go to voicemail. Then she listened to the message, which was 4 minutes and 20 seconds of exactly what she'd expected. He was sorry. He was confused. It had been going on for 2 months, and he didn't know how it happened. Sienna hadn't meant to. They hadn't meant to. And she sat at her kitchen table and ate her toast and thought about a notation system for undocumented outflows. She deleted the message. Her sister called 20 minutes later. She did not listen to that voicemail. She put her phone face down on the table and opened her laptop and started building the reconciliation summary for Vashon's review. The work was, she had to admit, interesting. Not morally uncomplicated, but interesting. The kind of financial puzzle she'd loved since she was a kid, making sense of her mother's grocery receipts, finding the patterns, making the columns balance. There was something satisfying about taking a ruin and making it orderly, about being the person in the room who could see what the numbers actually said. The money was also exceptional. She wasn't someone who talked about money, but she was someone who thought about it constantly, and the number Vachon had named at the ledger had been landing in her head at regular intervals since Monday, like a notification she hadn't turned off. She worked until 11. Then she put herself to bed with the kind of tiredness that came from actually using her brain, which was different and better than the kind that came from dread. Vashon was not. She was learning what she'd expected. She had built a working mental image of him based on available evidence. The suit, the scar, the way he moved through rooms, and it was the image of a man who operated by force of will and didn't particularly expect to be questioned. Most of the people around him seemed to confirm this. Gilles never questioned anything. The 2 men who were usually in the hallway when Margot arrived never spoke at all, just moved out of her way with a kind of practiced deference that suggested they'd been doing it for years. But Vashon questioned things. Not in the way of someone who doubted his own judgment, but in the way of someone who wanted to understand the precision of a thing before he committed to it. He asked her, on her 2nd week, to walk him through the notation system she'd developed. She'd expected polite attention. She got actual attention, the kind that came with follow-up questions, with why. "Here and not here," he said, pointing to 2 columns. "Because this one's a recurring pattern, and this one's an anomaly. They need different flags, or you can't sort them later. And if the anomaly becomes a pattern, then we reclassify it. I can build a conditional rule into the system." She hesitated. "Do you use spreadsheet software, or does Gilles handle that?" "Gilles handles it." "Show her the rule." "I will." She looked at him. "You understand accounting. Enough to know when someone's doing it wrong. That's actually sufficient." She paused. "Most people I explain systems to don't ask why. They just accept the structure." "Structures matter," Vachon said. He was looking at the columns, not at her. "A wrong structure looks right until it doesn't, and by then the damage is done." She thought about Brendan's explanation. The way he'd said he hadn't known how it happened. The structure had been wrong for a long time, probably. She just hadn't asked why often enough. "Yes," she said, "that's accurate." It was Gilles who told her about Dunmore on a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks in the same tone that Gilles told her everything, which was flat and factual and without apparent emotional investment. "He's been found," Gilles said. "Mr. Vachon wanted you to know. The situation has been resolved." Margot looked up from her monitors. Resolved. That's the word he used. She thought about asking for a more specific definition of resolved, and then decided she was not going to do that. She was not going to ask that question, and she was not going to think too hard about what the answer might be, and she was going to go back to her reconciliation summary and let Vachon's world operate the way it operated, which was not her department. "Thank you," she said. Gilles nodded and left. Margot sat there for a moment, very still, thinking about a man named Dunmore, who had stolen from the wrong person. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the columns. The night things changed was a Wednesday, 6 weeks in, and it started with a phone call she wasn't supposed to overhear. She'd been working late. Later than usual, the kind of late where the building went quiet around you, and the light from the monitors becomes the main source of illumination, and she'd gone to refill her coffee, and come back around the corner to find the hallway outside her workroom occupied by Vachon on a call that he hadn't expected anyone to witness. She stopped before he saw her. She wasn't listening. She was making a split-second calculation about whether to announce herself and interrupt or wait until he moved and pretend she hadn't heard anything, and the calculation was taking long enough that she absorbed more than she'd intended. The voice on the other end of the call was loud enough that she could hear its tone, if not its words. Demanding. Escalating. Vachon's voice, in contrast, was exactly what it always was. Flat, precise, unhurried. "The debt is not in question," he said. "What's in question is the payment structure. Come back to me with the actual figures and we'll talk." A pause. Another pause. "That's not how this works, you know that, and then—" "Don't threaten people you can't afford to threaten, Aldrin. It ages badly." He ended the call, turned around, saw Margot. She held up her coffee cup in a way that she hoped communicated, "I was just here for a refill and not at all assembled in the hallway absorbing your business." He looked at her for a moment. "Aldrin," he said, which was apparently his version of an explanation. "I didn't hear anything useful," she said. "What did you hear? That someone named Aldrin is bad at understanding payment structures." A pause. Then, "He'll be worse at them next week." She didn't ask what that meant. She refilled her coffee and went back to her room, and at 7:45 she packed up her things and found Vachon in the hallway, putting on his coat. "I can rebuild the debt ledger," she said, "if Aldrin is a recurring issue. If you have a clear structure for what's owed and by when, it's harder to dispute it. Harder to pretend the numbers are different than they are." Vachon finished buttoning his coat. "You're offering to manage my collections accounting. I'm offering to give you documentation so clean that nobody can argue with it." She picked up her bag. "Numbers aren't opinions. If it's written down correctly, it is what it is." He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the ledger that first night, when she'd said she'd do the numbers accurately regardless of convenience. "You'd need to understand the full scope," he said, "not just the operating accounts." "I figured. It's more complicated than what you've been looking at. I've been handling more complicated than anyone thinks since I was 11 years old," she said. "I'm not worried about complicated." He was quiet for a moment. In the quiet she could hear the building settling, the distant city noise from the windows, the very specific silence of a man making a decision. "Tuesday," he said. "I'll have Gilles put together a briefing." She nodded. She pressed the elevator button. "Margot." She looked back. "The photographer," he said. "Did you sort it?" She had, in fact, sorted it, 3 emails and a very specific citation of the Consumer Protection Act, but the fact that he'd remembered, the fact that he'd filed that away somewhere and come back to it 6 weeks later, caught her somewhere she wasn't expecting. "I handled it," she said. "Good." And then, with the same flatness as everything else he said, "You should have let me." The elevator doors opened. She stepped in. In the lobby, she sat in her car for a few minutes before she started the engine, not doing math for once. just sitting in the particular silence of someone who has started to realize that one thing is becoming a different thing and is not quite sure yet whether to be afraid of that or not. She decided she wasn't afraid. She started the car and drove home through a city that looked, in the particular way cities look on October nights when the leaves are mostly down and the lights are on and everything is wet and amber and close, exactly like something that was about to change. She'd been good at seeing change coming. She just hadn't always been good at deciding whether to walk toward it or away. This time, she thought she knew.